Yeah, there's something. Which I find is so interesting.
Stay far away from
Alrighty, I see a few stragglers grabbing some food and grabbing some seats, but figure we've got a lot of ground to cover, so we might as well get started. So I'm Doug Brake, Telecom Policy Analyst here at ITIF. Thank you all so much for joining us this conversation about the FCC sprint to a broadband privacy rulemaking and a few of the nuances we've encountered in that proceeding along the way. So we at ITIF, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank. Our mission is to formulate and promote public policies we think advance technological innovation and productivity growth. So this FCC broadband privacy rulemaking intersects obviously with a wide swath of the technology industry, both broadband and the sort of tech sector at the edge. Incredibly important proceeding as it affects technological innovation, productivity growth. So we have followed this quite closely and have been involved every step of the way. So yeah, to dive into a bit of an introduction or background on the issue, when the FCC, as a part of its, the microphone's working. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah, I don't know if we can turn it up, but or I'll just shout if that's all right. So the FCC. There we go. All right. All right, this should be good. All right, so the FCC, back with the Open Internet Order, decided to classify broadband providers as Title II common carriers, telecommunications carriers, using the Title II of the Communications Act. That triggered what's known as the FTC's common carrier exemption, effectively taking jurisdiction over broadband privacy from the Federal Trade Commission and usurping that for the Federal Communications Commission. So historically, the Federal Trade Commission would oversee a sort of general purpose uniform data privacy regime for more or less the entire economy, a few notable exceptions, including financial data, healthcare data. But the FTC approach generally requires companies to allow consumers to opt out of data collection and only opt in for sensitive information. In 2012, the FTC published a comprehensive set of guidelines recognizing broadband providers are similar to other large platform providers in the internet ecosystem. And this approach was advanced by the White House in the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights. The FCC, on the other hand, has recently proposed a set of heightened privacy restrictions specific to the broadband industry. Here, the FCC is relying on a different section of law, Section 222 under Title II, which governs what's known as Customer Proprietary Network Information, or CP&I. And so these are rules that were written over 2 decades ago, designed primarily concerned around competition in legacy telephone networks. And so the FCC is undertaking rather creative improvisation with a statutory authority to try to create a data privacy regime unique to broadband providers. So ITIF's sort of high-level point of view on this issue, we think it's important that customers have some choice in the matter, but how that choice is presented matters quite a bit to how innovation flows throughout the internet system. Most users are generally happy to share their data when there's a clear upside to doing so, but sometimes the benefits to data sharing and use are more diffuse and not immediately realized by consumers. So some of the advantages to greater data sharing, data innovation, and use include more effective advertising and also more competition in the advertising industry. So better advertising generally makes for a more efficient economy overall. There's some really good research that shows when you place heightened restrictions on targeted advertising, the advertisers just seek other ways to get those eyeballs, which leads to more intrusive advertising, more pop-ups and stuff like that. And so that's a sort of trade-off to be concerned about. Another advantage, easier sharing with third-party providers. You can share information, and this goes to security practices. A lot of the sort of nitty-gritty details around the specific data that we're talking about. It has important uses in terms of security and also innovative new uses in providing telecommunication services. And so there's a trade-off between sharing data freely to improve innovative offerings and data security. On the other hand, protecting consumer privacy, of course. Another advantage of sharing this information more broadly is more dynamic competition across industry platforms. I think in both directions. This is not just about broadband providers getting into the targeted advertising market, but also about more traditional advertisers and other large platform companies potentially entering broadband service market. So obviously, a very quick, very high-level overview. Thankfully, we've gathered 3 real qualified experts to help make sense of all these issues and delve a little bit deeper. So first, we have Neil Chilson here today. He's an attorney advisor to Commissioner Olhauser, and I should say we have more detailed bios on our website if you want to look those up, but very abbreviated. Neil works for Commissioner Olhausen, and there he covers many of the core issues that are near and dear to our hearts at ITIF. Covers internet privacy, data security, all of those sorts of issues. Before joining FTC, Neil was with Wilkinson Barker and Howard. Next, we have Nancy Liven, who's a partner at Jenner & Block, where she works on privacy and communications issues. She's formerly a Chief Privacy and Civil Liberties Officer with the U.S. Department of Justice, so very well qualified. Has a long history of working with these issues. And finally, we have Nicole Turner-Lee, who's Vice President and Chief Research and Policy Officer for the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council, MMTC. Nicole has long fought for civil liberties in the internet telecommunications space and is a passionate, articulate advocate. We're very happy to have her with us today. So by means of format, I think we're going to do this sort of like a traditional panel. First, we're just going to go down the line, hear from each of our panelists, sort of their high-level thoughts on the privacy proceeding. We're going to have a bit of a moderated Q&A. In that Q&A, we're going to delve into the specific topics that were outlined as part of this event. We want to talk about the sort of discounts for data issue. With the privacy advocates have termed the pay for privacy issue. We'll talk about that. Also want to talk about the recent case some of you may have been following out of the Ninth Circuit, the FTC versus AT&T, which impacts some of the jurisdictional questions around these issues. So with that, I'll turn it over to Neil. Hear your thoughts, your perspective from the Federal Trade Commission.
Sure. Thanks, Doug. As Doug said, I work for Commissioner Olhausen at the Federal Trade Commission covering these issues, and but with that, the standard disclaimer applies. My statements are only mine, they're not my bosses, they're not the other commissioners, and they don't necessarily represent the views of the FCC staff or commissioners. Really quick, I just want to talk about what the FTC's approach is to privacy, and what we said in our comments, our unanimous bipartisan comment to the FCC on the proposal. So, as Doug mentioned, the FTC's privacy approach is probably laid out most comprehensively in the 2012 report. That report was the end result of a 2+ year process that had multiple rounds of public comment and multiple drafts that were released. And in that report, the high level, most relevant thing for this discussion to take away is that the FTC was trying to set up a framework that allowed consumers to best express their privacy preferences in the marketplace. The main way that was structured in the report was talking about having simplified choice for consumers. And the choice architecture, to steal a term from Sunstein and Thaler, that was chosen by the FTC staff in that recommendation was an opt-in, opt-out, or implied consent framework, which might sound very familiar because those are the same terms that the FCC uses in its proposal. However, the distinguishing choice between those different categories under the FTC's framework has to do largely with the sensitivity of the data. And the reason is because when you're designing a choice architecture, or when you're trying to allow consumers to reveal their preferences in a marketplace, you want to give them, you want to distinguish between the different types of choices that you offer based on what they care about. So consumers care a lot about certain types of data. There's more uniform privacy preferences for sensitive data, such as health information, financial information, information about children. Those are areas in which consumers generally want to be asked before that data is used for a purpose that they didn't anticipate. For other types of data, non-sensitive data, consumers have really widely varying privacy preferences. Some people really care about that, some people don't care. In fact, the vast majority of people don't care as much as they do about sensitive information. So the FTC, the way the framework works essentially is to distinguish between sensitive and non-sensitive data. Now, I've heard a lot of discussion in reading the dockets and reading some op-eds about what sensitive data is, and I thought I'd just use a little bit of my time to correct what seemed like some misperceptions to me. This is the FTC's approach is not a normative one. We're not saying that this is the only type of data that people should care about. It is a descriptive one. It's saying this is what people care about. And second, it's more of an objective approach. This is what people on average care about, not what specific people care about. And the reason is because we're trying to set the defaults in that choice framework. And when you're trying to set a default, you need to look at what the average person cares about as far as sensitive data. So that's kind of been the FTC's approach. Let's see here. So I've heard some arguments that ISPs would have to spy on consumers in order to determine whether or not a certain amount of data was sensitive. And I can't really say this strongly enough. I think that's a real, a substantial misunderstanding of how the FTC does this. The FTC has always considered content to be sensitive. And if you do that, you don't have to spy on people. It's the same as having a letter carrier. It doesn't need to open a piece of mail to know that the person he's delivering it to does not want that mail read by him. So we've long considered the content of communications to be sensitive. Now to the FTC comment to the FCC. Again, it was a bipartisan, unanimous comment. It supported the general goals of protecting privacy, obviously, as we all do, I think. And it supported the focus on transparency, choice, and data security. Those are three of the dimensions of privacy that the FTC is focused on. It identified some significant problems and ones that I would characterize as fundamental. Most importantly, again, the difference in how the choice architecture is constructed is not based on the sensitivity of data, but essentially on who is holding the data. Now we can get into the details of how the FCC proposes that, but that is a major difference between the two frameworks, and it's one that the FTC's approach is seeking to match consumer preferences, and consumers care about sensitive versus non-sensitive data. They don't necessarily care or even know as much about who holds the data, and making differences between opt-in and opt-out based on who holds the data may not enable them to reveal their preferences. Yep, so the FTC staff comment talked about that as one of the major challenges in the FCC proposal. There were a bunch of other things that we added about data security, the length of breach notification. We can talk about those, but I don't want to take up everybody else's time. We can talk about those in the question and answer. I guess the only other thing I would add is that the staff comment also noted that the FCC's choice to use a different framework for opt-in and opt-out was not optimal, which was extremely polite way to disagree with it. And in part, that was because of the competitive effects that it could have to have two different conflicting approaches to privacy between competitors or potential competitors. And so, with that, turn it over to Nancy.
Very quickly,
Sure.
I think on Neil's comments, I think lays these issues out incredibly well. It really has come down to this question of choice architecture, and I think that framing it in those explicitly in those terms is well put. We've argued that in general we want to nudge consumers towards greater data sharing where existing protections are in place. They have an option to opt out. Consumers who are well motivated and have a heightened sensitivity about their privacy, their data security, can seek out that opt out. But otherwise, we think to promote innovation and productivity throughout the economy, which is our job here at ITIF, it's better to encourage greater data sharing. So setting up that choice architecture and nudging consumers a little bit more towards sharing information, especially when those benefits are more diffuse, is the right way to go. Nancy, you want to?
Sure. I'm sort of picking up on where Neil left off. Pick up on this notion of disparate treatment in the ecosystem, the ecosystem. So as Neil was alluding to, for years, ISPs, like other entities in the online ecosystem, were regulated under the FTC's flexible, technology-neutral data privacy and security framework, as well as industry codes of conduct and best practices that they had made themselves subject to. The FTC's framework, as Neil said, is based on the sensitivity of the data at issue, as well as driven by the context of the relationship between, in this case, the provider and the customer, and not, as Neil said, the type of entity that is handling or using or disclosing the data, or the type of service or product that an entity might be marketing. I think the evolution of the internet shows that this approach has been fundamentally sound and has worked well. It's protected consumers while allowing the internet to remain an open and dynamic marketplace where innovation can flourish. But the FCC obviously stepped in and changed the dynamic. Its classification of broadband internet access services as a Title II telecommunications service may have removed ISPs from the FTC's jurisdiction, but it did not otherwise change the nature of the internet ecosystem. And to the contrary, I think we can take a look at the record in the FCC proceeding, as well as the previous work that the FTC has done on the issue of large platform providers, including ISPs, browsers, and other large platform providers, to see that ISPs do not pose a unique privacy or security risk relative to other online entities. ISPs don't have comprehensive or unique visibility into consumers' online activity. One of the other interesting issues discussed in the FCC comments was the lack of incentive that ISPs have to engage in many of the activities that were described by some of the activities that were described as potential threats to consumer privacy. And the notion that ISPs had incentive to engage to use very intrusive technology to engage in intrusive practices was debunked not just by ISPs, but also by third parties who had no proprietary or other interest in the outcome of the proceeding. And finally, I want to note too that one thing that came out of this proceeding, we see that ISPs, and we can see this without looking at the comments in the proceeding, are the new entrants in the market for online data services, which is currently dominated by large incumbent edge providers. So many of the FCC's proposal, the shortcomings of the FCC's proposal were substantially covered in the comments, including the limitations on the Commission's statutory authority to promulgate these rules, the constitutional problems with the proposed rules, but a few of the shortcomings I hope we'll discuss today, and I just want to highlight what I think those are. One is the rules, the proposed rules are inconsistent with consumers' expectations in a converging online landscape where entities in the online ecosystem are starting to move to develop other business models and to move into to other areas and provide new services. Also, that the proposed rules aren't always tethered to actual privacy interests and could actually harm consumers, and that they could deny consumers the ability to obtain new products and services at lower costs. They could increase costs for consumers who subscribe to the underlying service, and also they could frustrate the user experience if the rules are as prescriptive as the proposed rules were. As Neil mentioned, another way forward would be to harmonize the proposed rules with the FTC framework, which has worked well and would ensure a uniform regulatory framework across the ecosystem.
Thank you very much, Nicole.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Neil and Nancy. So I'll pick up, it's always when you last, some of the stuff you guys have said, so I'll kind of pick up on where I think we've thought about this at MMTC. So I work at MMTC with other partner organizations. We've submitted to the record both comments and reply comments on this area. Just yesterday, I published something in Law 360 that was surrounding this whole privacy issue. And I know I look under 20, but I was around in this process of talking about the first rules of the road with the White House when they started to put together a privacy framework. So very much interested in this area, particularly as we look at some of the incongruencies that have already been pointed out. And I'm just gonna use my time, I think, to bring up 3 areas that I think have not been discussed that will complement, I think, what we've heard from others. One, I'd like to say that the FCC has taken on a lot this year. And this particular docket, I think, is just icing on the cake in terms of the additional burden that the FCC is taking on to try to solve this issue. My first point being that there was a multi-stakeholder process that actually was in place to come up with a great framework for privacy rules. For those of you in this room, we've spent a lot of time trying to harmonize the online consumer experience and the privacy protections around the Fair Information Practices Act, around the HIPAA rules and regulations, around the fair housing practices. And there's been a lot of discussion, much of it initiated from the FTC, on what does online privacy look like in the external world, and how do we have practices as well as policies that we could actually pull from to create a solid rules of the road. So in many respects, when this proceeding came out, it sort of ignored, I think, what you're hearing from a lot of people, what has already been done in the multi-stakeholder process from the White House to the FTC and other agencies like NTIA that have tried to come up with less broad stroke or more granular detail on how we make this work for consumers. So that's really my first point. We really need to look at this. Another area that we actually have learned in terms of history is post-Snowden, right? We've learned a lot about encryption and how to make data. I mean, it doesn't always work, right? But for the most part, we've had conversations about that. So to impose another set of rules and requirements that are not in sync with that, makes it to be a very interesting conversation nonetheless, because we, again, aren't benefiting those that we're supposed to, which are consumers. Which leads to my second point in terms of the consumer experience, and Nancy sort of talked about it. I want to point to Doug's great article on this at ITIF, where he talks about the purposes of CP&I data and how that system in and of itself needs to be restructured. Much of the FCC's jurisdiction post-Title II comes from the management of data under that legacy system. So here we are in another situation where we're really dealing with an outdated telecommunications law that is allowing us to go back and sort of reinvent the wheel on these types of policies and practices. And as Nancy said, the internet is a totally different experience. I just like to do a quick poll for people. How many people have a Facebook account and check your social media? How many people check your email? How many people use your mobile device or device at home, your residential device, to actually look at video? How many people know who's managing your privacy at what time? My point is exactly right. The internet is this one big transportation railway where people are doing so much more. And I think the point of Doug's article, if you haven't read it, which I found to be very intriguing, it's not just a common carrier service that we used to do. There's voice over IP, there's a convergence that Nancy talked about when we looked at digital disruption that has blended the ecologies of what traditionally was, you know, a common carrier versus an edge provider. And the presumption under the new FCC rules is that we as consumers have a pretty static experience when it comes to the internet. And as you'll see if you get my article that I wrote that was submitted yesterday, for consumers to understand where the accountability lies when it comes to harm, it's just confusing under this new regime. Where do they go? How do they figure out, was it a social media and edge provider infraction? Was it an infraction on the part of my ISP? And as Nancy said, ISPs collect less data than your social media is collecting about you on every occasion. So that's one of the things I think secondary is pretty problematic about what we're trying to do. One, reinvent the multi-stakeholder process, but then ignore the customer expectations when it comes to how they actually manage their privacy. And then as an advocate, one of the things that we placed in one of our filings, which I think was a subtle note, you know, granted for many of you that are in here, you might come back to me later and say, Nicole, but the FCC doesn't have jurisdiction. We as civil rights groups would have liked to have seen any new proposed privacy framework deal with the bigger issue of big data discrimination and predictive analytics. The fact that we're taking the time to actually propose new rules on ISPs that, one, as Peter Swire has said, collect very little data about us. Two, that most people don't know what data they're collecting. And we're going to get into this mandatory opt-in regime too, which means that even though I'm a customer of an ISP, I also have to opt in for discounts and related to my subscription service. That should make us all wonder why that's the case in terms of financial inducements. But for communities of color in particular, we would have liked to see the oxygen spent thinking about how do you create a privacy regime that gets at this new a sense of and source of confusion for consumers, which is big data discrimination, predictive analytics, data profiling. You know, could the energy be spent harmonizing frameworks that allow us to deal with it as a bigger issue as opposed to a smaller coal that affects consumers? So again, I mean, I'll just stop there. I mean, I think, again, we echo a lot of the sentiment here that it should not be different strokes for different folks. And disparate regulations, rules and regulations really don't heed to the consumer's logic of how they use the internet today. And we're just going down a pathway that appears to be one that will be more contentious as opposed to more productive in creating a more proper privacy framework that gets at some of the burgeoning issues.
So Nicole referenced, already so far we've had a pretty wide-ranging discussion. Nicole referenced the Peter Swire's report, which early in the debate sort of set the terms of around whether or not it's even justifiable to have sector-specific rules on the broadband industry. And there laid out a number of issues that are reducing the visibility that ISPs have into consumer data. I'm hopeful. It seems that a lot of the privacy debate here has moved on past that, and the FCC, according to recent reports, is looking more and more like they are eyeing this sort of alignment with the FTC approach. So if we could back up, and this is a question for Neil, but feel free to jump in. and Nancy or Nicole. So I wonder if you could sort of pull back and just at sort of very high level, here we're talking about ITIF, talk about innovation, how you think the FTC approach promotes innovation, especially as compared to the sort of proposal that the FCC has laid out.
Well, I think the 2012 report and our multiple workshops on big data, Internet of Things, they all talk about the incredible value that data and information about consumers for consumers has in our modern economy. Allowing those data flows to happen is extremely important to innovation and to consumer welfare. And so the goal is, when we're talking about privacy, I think one thing that the FTC does very well when it's thinking about this issue is to recognize that privacy isn't the only value that consumers have. They have a lot of different values, and they make choices and they balance those values all the time. And so, whether it's convenience, price, if it's security, safety, these are things that consumers balance against privacy all of the time. So whether it's the CVS card that you use to get a discount, by trading, some information about what purchases you're making, or whether it's law enforcement purposes for using data, these trade-offs are really important. And so when the FTC considered how to set up this choice framework initially, it thought about how do we let people make the choices and balance their preferences among different values in a way that both protects the consumer, but then also protects the average consumer, and then also allows for there to be choice in the marketplace for those who don't have the same or the average privacy preference. And so that's kind of the FTC's, that's been its approach, is to maximize the range of consumer choices that are available while giving a framework that matches consumer preferences. And I think that has really served well to allow information to flow in a way that while allowing consumers to make decisions. And so we have an emergent marketplace of information and innovation that really does benefit consumers for the most part.
Yeah, people.
I would just, just to add to what Neil said, just drawing on two principles that the FTC relies heavily on, that the FCC could adopt and I think should adopt. One is context. The way I think that the FTC, and I defer to Neil on this, but is able to provide the flexibility that enables innovation and the use of data, as well as providing a strong level of consumer protection, is to center and ground its choice framework in the context of the relationship between the company and the consumer, so that there's no surprise to the consumer. The consumer's expectations are aligned with the company's business practices. And I think because the online ecosystem, and Nicole mentioned earlier, the old voice rules were very static and rigid and designed to address unique problems in an industry that Congress was addressing in the 1990s. We're talking about a very different environment now. If you ground your choice regime in the notion of context of the relationship, then you as a regulator are able to evolve along with technology, along with the marketplace, and that kind of approach, I think, is wonderfully suited to the internet ecosystem. The other principle I would just note that the FTC draws on, which again I think just contributes to the strength of its framework, is reasonableness. So whether we're talking about standards for de-identification of data or data security practices, they are grounded in this notion of what is reasonably practical, what would reasonably be done with information, again, allowing enforcement and regulation to evolve with technology, with consumer expectations. And I think those are two real strengths of the framework.
And I would just echo what everybody has said. I mean, one of the neat things that we found, and we responded in our second filing to the FTC's comments and how they could be harmonized with the FCC was trying to do, was this whole level of the type of sensitive data that people wanted to share. And whereas the FTC has been focused a lot, I think if we were to put them into boxes on privacy and what protections need to be in place in a market-driven ecosystem, the FCC is really talking about micromanagement and transparency, right? Which, again, many consumers at this point with their personal identifiable information know what to share and what not to share. And I think that's the distinction we're talking about in terms of contextualizing the consumer's choice about what they want to put out into the marketplace, which has been the FTC approach, versus saying, well, if you want to, and I know we're going to get to this, if you want to get access to X, you have to be able to tell the ISP that you're going to allow them to access that. Well, certain things are not that important. If you're starting to get into my medical records and my educational history and areas that are more sensitive, then obviously I think like the FTC pointed out, there's cause for concern and disclosures and other things need to be in place. But I think, again, that consumer choice thread is one that I think many of us would like to see more integrated into the FCC's approach.
If I can offer from my moderator's seat one tidbit to add on top, we at ITAF have been fans of the FTC approach in this area at an even more abstract level, simply because it's a sort of ex-post enforcement regime versus an ex-ante rulemaking regime, the FCC. So of course, privacy advocates sort of like that aspect of the FCC. Privacy advocates can step in and get really strong rules of the FCC. Whereas FTC, where they set sort of more abstract guidelines and then step in when companies either violate those guidelines or don't stick to the promises they make to consumers, we think that allows for more business model innovation and flexibility within those guidelines. Whereas the FCC approach seems to be more designed to deny ISPs that sort of business model innovation. They have an idea of what sort of business ISP should be in, and they want to put broadband providers in that box. And so, to my mind, this is sort of a further encroachment of the move to common carriage, where Wheeler promised the common carrier of the 21st century with these net neutrality rules. This seems to me a step back, the common carrier of the 19th and 20th century. So yeah, moving on, I want to sort of narrow in on this sort of the process of aligning the FCC's proposal with the FTC approach. And so, as I mentioned, the FCC is sort of improvising with a few different categories it has under its statutory authority. There's the customer proprietary network information. There's a sort of broader category of customer information and personally identifiable information. And so, I'm hoping we can drill down and sort of get a sense of how those sort of legal frameworks should be matched onto the FTC's framework. And if you have thoughts on what types of information should fall in what bucket, unfortunately we're unable to get a technologist to really dig into the details of the specific types of data. But I'm particularly curious about where you think web browsing information, just sort of like high level information about where people are going on the internet, where that should fall in this sort of framework.
Well, I don't know exactly where it would fall within the CP&I rules, and I think it's within the FTC's framework. The way that we've thought about web browsing traffic is, I think it can be.
As opposed to content.
So it's interesting. Web browsing traffic, I think, can fall within one of those categories of an implied. It's implied by the transaction. So if I make a request to a web browser and that web browser then goes out onto the internet and hits a DNS server, that URL, I'm providing that to get information back. To get that address back, and so I think generally that's part of the transaction. Now there's a lot of people in that that chain that touch that information, including finally the website that it's on. So the question is, what is the consumer expectation when I send that sort of information out into the world? And I think the FTC's approach thus far has been that the consumer expectation when they send a request out into the world is, similar to sending a letter to a catalog company and getting a response back. Like, the address that's on the outside of that letter is not private information. And so I think that's kind of been the way it worked. Now, I think where people get concerned about this is if you're going to aggregate a bunch of this and then tell something sensitive about people. Well, the question is, can you tie that to an individual? So would it be personally identifiable information? And if you can, what would the consumer expect on that? So I think the tying it to an individual has been the part where the FTC has been focused. And on that point, I'll just say, and maybe this has some distinctions for the FCC, under the FTC's approach, just because something's personally identifiable doesn't mean it's sensitive. There's lots of things that are personally identifiable that aren't sensitive. My name, it's right there. And my address, probably not. It's in lots of phone books. So those sorts of things, consumers don't have the same expectation for those that they have about other categories, more traditional categories such as health information and financial information. So I think I wandered all around your question.
I would just add that, just drawing on what Neil said about I think the FTC's privacy report talked about, with respect to web browsing history, that a comprehensive tracking of consumers online and developing a detailed profile of somebody is very different than just snippets of information. And if we're talking about a snippet of web browsing history, that is not categorically inherently sensitive. If I go to CNN.com, I don't have any discernible privacy interest in that if not protected would cause great harm to me or any appreciable harm to me. So I think that I hope the commission distinguishes the way the FTC did with respect to web browsing history between collecting bits of information and a comprehensive profile of somebody. Those two categories of information ought to be looked at differently. And I think even the FTC in its report didn't even go so far as to say that the comprehensive collection would require a certain type of treatment, but that just recognize the difference between the two.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is an area that obviously is concerning to us. And I want to put a huge shout out to the FTC because Chairwoman Ramirez has been very active in how aggregated web browsing history lends itself to discriminatory practice. And the FTC has had several, if not hundreds, right, of actions where people's web browsing history has been more targeted and has resulted in differential outputs when it comes to purchasing, credit, blah, 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 right? And that's where it becomes more problematic. And I think that's where these rules become really shady, right? Because you cannot tell how deep in the bowels of the web there's authority and who has authority over what, right? And if you go again back on the data of what ISPs are collecting and the fact that, under the FCC's framework or proposed privacy regime, they're talking about opt-in for consumers for ISPs. So it seems to me with that kind of stringent overlay that you're actually going to have less concern with the ISPs going deeper in the bowels of web browsing than edge providers, right? And so I think, again, if you're trying to harmonize both, there are lots of lessons that the FTC has learned, again, looking at infractions as consumers address those versus doing more hypothetical harms and sort of constructing those prior to, because of the dynamism of the web. If anybody leaves here with anything outside of the wonderful knowledge of the four of us, right, is that this is a complex issue, right? And it's an issue that does not necessarily have a start and a stop. And there are various iterations of where consumers find themselves. And there's been approaches to sort of looking at that aggregated history and figuring out if it's beneficial to the data innovation flows or it's not. right? And so I think that's, again, this is where this conversation becomes really tricky in terms of how you apply these different, rules to different people. And clearly, Doug, on your paper, we weren't looking at that with legacy telephone service. It was your call number, how long you were on the phone, and what kind of services you had. You were not trying to figure out who they called, what time, when they called that person, etc. It's just a different animal.
Yeah, and building on that, it's not just like a much more limited set of information, but it's also a much more limited set of players in the ecosystem, right? It's all telephone companies, and they're worried about competition between telephone companies. Yeah, it's very different.
And maybe just to circle back a little bit, I think that is, one of the things that has kept the FTC's attention in this space has been a focus on consumer harm. It's built into our statute, and so if we're going to bring in action, there has to actually have been consumers that were harmed, either through a deceptive act that changed their but for the deceptive statement, they would have made a different decision, or under unfairness, there has to be a substantial injury that isn't outweighed by consumer benefit or competition. And so that focus, I think, on consumer harm has helped keep us away from the sort of like weird hypotheticals, because those cases, people aren't using data that way, and when they are, we bring cases against them when it causes consumer harm. And so when you move from the hypothetical to the actual, I think you find out that it can be very hard to deal with hypothetical cases, but in the real world, when there's consumer injury, that's a really good guide, and the FTC has been effective in bringing cases where there's consumer injury.
Thank you. So again, on the FTC, or the FCC aligning with the FTC approach, some of the privacy, and Neil, you already touched on some of this. If you want to build on your answer, or maybe hear from others. But some of the privacy advocates in the docket have argued that this approach of categorizing information according to its sensitivity and treating sensitive data differently, giving that an opt-in rather than opt-out for less sensitive information. Some privacy advocates have argued that would be too cumbersome for broadband providers. I find it somewhat amusing. It seems like that's not really their argument to make, but maybe it's their best argument. But I'm curious what sort of frameworks exist in other contexts where other players in the internet ecosystem, how do they already treat sensitive information? Is this something that we already have procedures, protocols designed for? Or is this something that ISPs would have to be attacking anew? Neil, you already touched on this, but if you have...
No, yeah, I mean, I'm a bit puzzled by that argument. Our orders, the companies that we have under order for privacy include some big ones, Google, Facebook, and a lot of small ones. And the argument that they haven't been able to implement opt-in for sensitive data, I don't know that we've heard that, or the distinction between sensitive and non-sensitive. And I think really it's drawn from this challenge has been drawn from this sort of idea that when we're talking about sensitive data, we're talking about what might be sensitive to any particular person at any time. And that's not the approach that the FTC is taking. And if you were trying to determine, do a customized opt-in regime for every single individual, I guess that might be burdensome, but that's not the regime that the FTC is suggesting. And so I don't fully understand that challenge. I think ISPs were under the FTC's approach before, and they seem to do a good job. And they were able to comply with the FTC's approach for the most part. We did one case, but yeah. So I don't understand that argument that they wouldn't be able to do this if the FCC set up something that was very similar to the FTC.
Sure. Yeah. I think just drawing on what Neil said, and again, I defer to Neil on the FTC's approach to sensitive data and the opt-in requirement, but the opt-in, the trigger for the opt-in requirement was, at least I think based on the report, when sensitive data is used to draw inferences about somebody and then to target them based on those inferences which had to do with the sensitivity of the data. So if you are using someone's financial data to target to them certain credit opportunities, that would fall into that category of the use of sensitive data that might trigger an opt-in requirement, whereas if you're using that data for some other purpose, had nothing to do with their financial condition, it might not, and it was very context dependent. And so that is something that has been on the books, so to speak, guidance that's been out there for over 4 years now. And as Neil said, has been used by companies in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I would disagree. I agree just for the time on everything that was said. The only caveat I would say the reason that many groups have gotten involved too with the PII debate is also on re-identification of those respondents. So there's been a whole debate around, the extent to which you can get down to the granular elements to locate a single individual. And if they are anonymized, can you actually go back and find them? And I think those are the cases that have been a little tricky when it comes to your PII.
You read my mind. That's the next question on de-identified or aggregate anonymized data. How does the FTC treat those sort of classes of information of de-identified data? And how do you think that the FCC should move forward on those questions?
Well, the way the FTC has dealt with that has been, they talk about reasonably linkable to a consumer. If it's either identifies an individual or it's reasonably linkable to an individual, that reasonably linkable, I think, is part of one of the comments that they gave to the FCC. That the FCC standard just said linkable, and the question is, if you throw enough computing power in the world of data today, you might be able to link stuff to consumers, to a specific consumer, but is that the sort of thing that's happening in the marketplace? And I think this, again, comes from the FTC's looking at consumer harm. We want to make consumers better off, so we should tackle the problems that are occurring, not the ones that we can hypothesize. And so so I think that reasonably linkable is how we've treated identification or de-identification of data. If it's de-identified in a way that is effective, that it is not reasonably linkable to a consumer, then I think the FTC has said that falls outside of the sensitive information category.
I think it's worth noting there is some, a kind of a trade-off here, right? It's like if data is more easily, could be more easily be used to identify a person, it's probably more useful in a sort of targeted advertising context. At the other end, it's like there are very reasonable steps that can be taken to, by and large, de-identify data for most vast majority of consumers. There's always going to be outliers with very peculiar tastes that would be easier to identify, for example. And so this is an area where there's some nuance and trade-off, and it seems to me, at least from my reading, the FCC came down on sort of the far end of that spectrum in the requirements. Do you have any other thoughts, Nancy or Colby?
I think the approach the FTC has taken has been a good one. It has the three-part test with a combination of technical, for lack of a better word, and administrative control. So if a company takes reasonable measures to de-identify data, publicly commits not to re-identify it, and then contractually binds any third parties to which it discloses the data not to re-identify it, then that data is considered sufficiently de-identified to fall outside the framework. And to Neil's point, the reasonable measures should ensure that the data isn't reasonably linkable. And I think the great part about this test is that the companies need to use de-identified data for all sorts of things. They use it to improve their services, for internal operations, compliance purposes, and so forth. And so this really allows companies to provide consumers and with the services that they need to, and also to improve those services and develop new ones. I think I would also just mention that some have argued in this proceeding that data that even theoretically, and Neil was touching on this, could be re-identified through some kind of Herculean technical efforts, cannot be considered de-identified data. That's just completely antithetical to the approach the FTC has taken. And in if taken to its logical extreme, would render the phrase individually identifiable meaningless, because then everything would be, and you wouldn't need to characterize information as such. So I think, research has shown, and this came up in some of the comments, that actually re-identification can be tricky. You have to have an alternative data set in order to do it, and you have to have some pretty good skills, technical and computer skills, in order to do that. And so I'd leave it at that. But I think there's room for improvement on de-identification and what the FCC has proposed.
And I was just going to say, sort of bring it back to these two frameworks. This is where I think, again, the FCC versus FTC approach is interesting, because if you think about the amount of data, I mean, we're having a whole de-identification conversation here, right? The amount of data that ISPs actually collect is not that much to actually cause the type of hypothetical harms that we're discussing. I just want to say, I mean, your ISP knows where you live, probably. They know what kind of service you subscribe to. I don't think they know your health records and other things, that you do on the web, because that's outside of what the scope of data they can actually collect. And so part of this conversation becomes interesting, again, to the point of the history that's been taken by the FTC to sort of go deeper with the academic community, engineers, policymakers, from the executive office and other regulatory agencies to understand what this means. I mean, folks, we're still in the midst of this conversation of what privacy means. And so again, to have a new set of rules that turn around and get into these complex debates is really interesting, right? Because it sets the stage for a lot more confusion, particularly for broadband service providers that are not necessarily in the midst of the throes of what data is actually being collected. So I think that's an important distinction to make, because if we were having this conversation talking primarily about the primary activities that most consumers have on the web, this would definitely be an issue. And I think the FTC, did a whole de-identification piece, not this year, but last year, and had researchers who basically said that they could actually not necessarily use computer-generated programs, but they could go back and look at where the data was collected to determine what kind of community a person lived in, to get down to the granular detail, which is what the FTC is still trying to fix. But I just don't think that applies to ISPs at the level of complexity.
So I'm hoping to save at least 15 minutes for questions from the audience. But before we do, wanted to transition and talk a little bit about the discounts for data issue and the Ninth Circuit case. But please be thinking of any burning questions. So we wrote a quick report on the discounts for data issue, or as the privacy advocates have framed it, the paper privacy offers. So I think it sort of generated from our point of view, a surprising amount of discussion. We see this as really the same as any sort of other price differentiation or constant price discrimination that takes place, widespread throughout the internet ecosystem. Most all of, or not, I shouldn't say most all, but many edge provider services are sort of premised on this trade-off, right? If we get access to some of your data, then we will offer you this service for free. In the broadband context, of course, that price difference isn't able to reduce the price of broadband all the way to free, though there are some interesting models that suggest that might be possible under some circumstances. But yeah, this is very similar to commonplace price discrimination, but this time around individual users' privacy preferences. And so again, it's important that consumers have a wide variety of different privacy preferences. And we think that allowing them to make trade-offs around their monthly bill, trade-offs around their privacy preferences is good policy. Very similar to like a rewards program at a grocery store, right? Generally accepted. There's a lot of discussion. There's some privacy advocates saying that this will take advantage of those least well-off, that people will not be able to sort of make this. It won't be a meaningful choice. If you are offered a discount and that is extremely meaningful to you, then you'll opt in without even if you're extremely privacy sensitive. First of all, I think it's worth noting that AT&T experimented with this model. They've since canceled the program, which I think is telling. But I think it's worth noting that their AT&T had only offered this option where you would opt in to share your information in exchange for a discount on their most expensive broadband product. And so, to my mind, it probably makes a lot more sense that they're targeting those consumers with more money to spend with targeted advertising rather than those least well off. But at the same time, I think it's, just important that we note that assuming these are fair deals and no one's coerced, those who spoil off would be the ones who would benefit the most if they're having to make that trade-off. And so I think this is an area that FCC should maintain some flexibility. Agree, disagree, thoughts on the issue? Yeah.
Well, so my boss, Commissioner Olhausen, in her separate statement in the comment to the FCC on their proposal, mentioned this topic and said that essentially, stepping back, a ban on these types of practices is essentially saying, even if the consumer is fully informed, we're not going to let them make that choice. Even if they're willing and with consent, and they know everything about this program, and they want to trade some of their information for a discount, that we're not going to let them do that. And that's from a competition perspective, that's an unusual thing to say, and from a consumer protection perspective as well, from the FTC. And so I think in the broadband market, where price is one of the limits on adoption, there would be some concern that if we're not allowing consumers to make the sorts of trade-offs between privacy and other values that they make every day, that we'd be actually restricting consumers' choices, and that would not be a net positive for them.
We've been very supportive of these financial incentives for particularly low-income consumers, and I'll tell you why. One reason is we believe that consumers have a different relationship with their ISP than they might have with an edge provider, right? They pay to that service. Even though people publicly say they don't like their service, they still stick with their service. I'm one of them, right? You just don't let go of your service, and you have a particular relationship that you've built up with that ISP. You have a particular relationship with that retail store. I know I just upgraded my son's phone for something, and I went in and said, hi, they've seen me about 10 times, right? So they see you, they know you. So part of the challenge with the financial inducements for us were two things. One, if you have this relationship with your ISP and now they cannot create targeted advertising that can potentially benefit you cost-wise, then you are actually subject now to a predatory third-party market that can actually bring you the same services, and you would not realize how much that marketplace or that third-party market tier is actually charging you. So why should I, as a customer who's already opted into a relationship with my ISP, want to go outside of it? So I give this perfect example. When I upgraded my son's phone, for example, we went into the particular store of the ISP, it was offered to me based on, my prior purchasing history to buy a phone case. And the phone case would be discounted and it would be bundled into this new service that I got. Of course, I said yes, because it was easier for me because I've already have the line of activity or business activity with that particular ISP. It's bundled into my service. It was trustworthy. I didn't have to leave and go find it someplace else, and it was discounted. Under the FCC rules, something like that might be banned unless I totally opt into my ISP and say, hey, you can know everything about me, sell me those things. And I think consumers just don't think that way, particularly when it comes to their ISP. I think it's an unrealistic expectation that we're actually saying, well, the ISPs, when again compared to edge providers, cannot engage in that type of targeted advertising, much like the commissioner said. With the caveat, and again, I put forth the caveat, and I love Doug's paper where he talked about the AT&T model was, this appeared to be predatory and the program was ended. The transparency around that particular program, the disclosures are very important, obviously. And everything that we talked about prior are part of building that equation, building that trust for consumers. But again, to tell consumers, your relationship with your ISP, sorry, they cannot market anything that might save you money. In the end, will have a disparate impact on the consumers who, again, will be placed into this other marketplace. So I really think that argument for me, particularly for groups like MMTC that deal with low-income, historically disadvantaged populations that fall within the Pew study, limit more opportunities to get people engaged in the digital economy.
Okay, sorry, let me just make one more point that I forgot to make earlier on that. The FTC actually has weighed in on or has had discussions about these sorts of practices. Our big data report summarized some of those discussions made by commenters. I think the NPRM by the FCC slightly misstated and said that was our conclusion, but we were summarizing a discussion that happened at the workshop. In fact, the FTC said basically that in markets with sufficient alternatives where the terms of exchange are transparent and fairly disclosed, such choice options may result in lower prices or other consumer benefits as companies develop new and competing ways of monetizing their business models. And so the FTC's approach to this has been essentially one of maximizing consumer choice in the marketplace, and as long as those choices are adequately informed and the options offered are not deceptive.
That's right, that's right.
So I'm a bit concerned we're a little low on time, but we did advertise this as discussing the FTC versus AT&T case out of the Ninth Circuit, and I would hate for Neil to come after me for a false advertising claim. So I apologize. I know I tend to talk too quickly anyways, but I think we can try to get through this issue very quickly. It's a kind of a murky, complex case, but hopefully we can lay out a few of the issues. So this case stems from AT&T's sort of slowing speeds on their unlimited plan. So they had some legacy users that were grandfathered in onto unlimited monthly data plans. Some of those, the long tail of users, some of them on the outside, were using considerable amounts of data, and so after a certain threshold, AT&T would slow their internet speeds. So it's simultaneously, or I guess I believe FTC was actually first in bringing an enforcement action. FTC and FCC both brought enforcement actions against AT&T for this practice. And so at least in their defense, in the case the FTC brought, AT&T said, hey, we're a common carrier. You don't regulate us. The FCC regulates us. And so the case came down to this narrow question, and this was dealing with what at the time was a non-common carrier service. At the time was Broadband was a non-common carrier service. They're saying we're a common carrier with regards to our wireless voice product. A little wrinkle, but and so the case came down to this question of whether or not where this line gets drawn is determinative of whether AT&T was whether the common carrier exemption to the FTC Act, where that line gets drawn, is quote status-based or activities-based. And the court came down on the side of status-based, meaning once AT&T has the status of a common carrier, then the FTC exemption is triggered, and the FTC loses oversight over all of AT&T's activity. I think so. That's a description of what the case said. Our reading of it was, I think that there was, in the immediate aftermath, there was a lot of discussion around this creating an even bigger void, an even bigger jurisdictional gap between FTC and FCC. I think that those claims were overblown. I think that this is something of a blip on the radar that will get corrected. I think there's a number of ways that it will get corrected. I mean, first of all, this is just a panel. FTC has appealed it, and I think that there are really good ways for the on an en-banc review for the court to overturn its earlier decision. First of all, it's worth noting that the case itself contains some limiting language where it talks about in distinguishing prior case law that these are the core activities. The AT&T's voice product is a core activity as a common carrier. Its common character is a core activity to what it does. And so I think that sort of edge products of common carriers like Verizon's Go90 or stuff like that, I think those are not necessarily core activities. And so that is a good place to draw a line where sort of edge services of common carriers would fall to the FTC instead of the FCC. But I think even on review, if you look, it's kind of amazing, the court, when reading the FTC statute, essentially stopped there. If you're subject to the Common Carrier Act of Commerce, then that stops the conversation. But once you can go from there and look to the way FCC actually subjects companies to the common carrier provisions of the Communications Act, that's all activities based. The FCC's jurisdiction is clear over common carriers is clearly defined in terms of activities. So if the court decides to go just one step further and look at how the FCC actually subjects companies to common carriage, that's activities based. And so I think that there's a really clear answer on review, or the Supreme Court or other circuits want to go a different way. And so I think that this is not cause for great alarm. I think it's one more reason that the FCC should align its rules with the FTC, and one more reason to do away with the common carrier exemption altogether, but that's a bigger, longer question for Congress to deal with.
Right.
But yeah, that's sort of our reading of what's going on. Okay, agree, disagree, thoughts?
Well, I do think this case, this decision raises a bunch of concerns for the FTC's enforcement, not just in the privacy space, but in the wide range of consumer protection activities that we do, including fraud, advertising, lots of other spaces, because this exemption applies to all of those spaces, not just our privacy and data security enforcement. And so I don't think that carve out in the language was particularly clear or helpful. It's stated in the negative. It's a little confusing, so it's not clear what core activities would be. It also talks about like non-incidental activities, and I just don't know. It's not clear what that will mean going forward, but it does mean that there will be companies who are bad actors who will raise this defense and make it harder for the FTC to bring cases. And when I mean cases, again, we're talking everything from COPPA to do not call. There's some possibility that this decision affects the ability of the FTC to protect consumers in those spaces. So I think there is a gap. I don't think there's other agencies can't fill this gap if that status-based designation is applied broadly. There's lots of things that the FTC can do that other agencies can't. We don't have a one-year statute of limitations like the FCC does, for example. The other ones, FCC is very limited to they're limited to telecom activity, and they've and stuff done in connection to that. So I think there's lots of billing practices and other things, advertising that the FTC has been able to reach that I'm not sure there's anybody else that's able to effectively. So I think there is big concern about this. As you mentioned, there's a longstanding bipartisan ask that the common carrier exemption, which was set up in a time of a pervasively regulated entities, that's outdated now, and that it would be more appropriate in a world of convergence to allow the FTC to protect consumers on a uniform basis.
Yeah, I don't really have too much to add to that, other than I agree that the court suggested some limiting principle, but it's not clear what that means, what they meant by that, and that there is a gap. It's unclear who would regulate common carriers' provision of other services. And I agree with Doug as well. I think, this is just an issue that's ripe either for rehearing or clarification in the courts otherwise, or else Congress. So I don't think this is where things will stand.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is going to be a congressional action that will have to be taken to rid that exemption, because what has happened is, much of what we talked about so far, you get rid of that law enforcement and those rules and practices that the FTC has put in place, and essentially taken a hands-off approach, which is not good for everybody. I think that, I think the assumption that some people want to make is that, people who are basically calling out the FCC's rules as being very ambiguous are saying there should be no privacy protections at all, and that's not what people are saying, right? People are just saying it needs to be fair, appropriate, and reasonable, and not necessarily something that is going to be disparate, disjointed, and segmented. And I think this case, in many respects, I've spoken to both sides. Some people saw it as victory. Others are like, holy crap, what's going to happen next, right? Because you basically created this vacuum where the FTC, who has spent so much time really looking at other things besides what the FCC is going to, quote unquote, regulate, and now, their jurisdiction has been pretty much taken away from them. So I think Congress really needs to step in here, as opposed to sit back and wait for the litigation to the onslaught, and really begin to think about what this convergence looks like, much like Neil said.
So with that, we have, I apologize, only 10 minutes left for questions from the audience. But yes, please, I think we've got a microphone coming. If you can give your name and affiliation, that would be great.
Hi, Rick Weber, Insight Cybersecurity. So, Nicole, you said Congress. Other panelists, do you think this is something that Congress is going to have to weigh in after the circuit ruling? And then, secondly, the FCC is supposed to issue these rules by the end of the year. So, can we negotiate a deal here, or is that going to wind up in court also?
well, can we whisper that he should delay this item as well and take it off the docket? If there's any reporters here, our recommendation is delay this vote too. And we'll come back and revisit this. Yeah, I mean, I think the FCC needs to put more thinking to this. The net neutrality rules and type 2 just went into effect. And clearly there was this obvious void of the Section 222, but now people are saying, let's think this through. And I think the strong, much like, and I don't want to put two issues together, but much like the copyright division reacted to the set-top box, I think the FTC is reacting to the privacy rules. And when you have partner agencies sort of coming out very strong with regards to how you can improve upon this standard, it's well worth it to sit back and wait. And maybe it may not be the Wheeler Commission, it'll be somebody else's commission. I don't think it's going to go away, but we really need time to comprehensively think through these things. So that's why I think Congress needs to step in if it's going to become another stalemate.
Well, on the common carrier exemption issue, I think there's plenty of opportunity for that case to be overturned. I think it was wrongly decided, and so I think that's one possible avenue. Repeal of the common carrier exemption is that's a different effect than the overturning of this case, and so I don't know. I mean, that's another way to solve the problem, but it solves some other problems as well. So maybe that has some appeal. And then on the timing for the FCC, the FTC doesn't have a lot to say about that. I would just point out that the privacy report that came up with the FTC's framework was a 2-year process, 2-year plus process that involved a lot of public hearings and events, and that was to come out with a report and not a industry-wide set of very specific rules. And so, given that background, if the FCC's approach was identical to that, I would say they'd have a good basis. But if they're going to do something different, they should. Yeah, it does seem like thinking it through well would be advised.
Delay the vote.
Yeah, I would just add that, with respect to the FCC's rules, if you look at the tens of thousands of comments that were filed, the FCC still does not have a record to justify the rules, certainly the proposed rules, and I think that they're on shaky ground going forward.
Yeah, Dallas.
Hi, Dallas Harris with Public Knowledge, and I have a couple of questions, some of which have points to them, some don't. I'll let you decide.
If you could narrow it down to the ones with points, it'd be appreciated.
Mostly for Neil. So the FTC determined which types of information were sensitive and non-sensitive based upon a public comment period, is that correct? Right, you guys asked the public, what do you think is sensitive and non-sensitive? And that's how you came up with what you guys have put in your framework as sensitive versus non?
That's part of it, but those categories are not, this isn't a rule, right? So sensitive and non-sensitive, this can depend on what comes before the commission and what consumer harms are being affected. And so I think obviously the goal is to determine sensitive information based on consumer preferences. And again, because the goal is to set a baseline and we're creating a choice architecture, we're saying what are the most common areas of sensitivity? What are the things that everybody generally agrees this is sensitive? And so then then we set the then we talk about the framework that way. And so so it's not as clear cut like it's as maybe it's not static. This will really depend on what consumers' preferences are, and so that's been the FTC approach.
Is it possible that consumers prefer that their CP&I be treated as sensitive information? And if there was that on the record, would you support an opt-in regime for all CP&I?
Consumer preferences are there's expressed preferences and then there's polled preferences, and those can be very different. And when you're considering how to effectuate consumer preferences in the marketplace with the choice architecture, polls alone are not a great way of determining that. And so I think if you look at some of the economist literature in this space, that would kind of inform that answer.
Okay.
Okay, I think that is a big part of the challenge is that
Right.
so many of these times when you ask consumers about, how they want their data to be treated, so much depends on how you frame the question.
Right, which is why I brought up Dallas earlier, some of the conversations we had years ago with regards to sensitive information. I mean, I can remember places like the Aspen Institute and the White House having these conversations, was how is that person, and I see Rudy here who's in a lot of those conversations, how is PII also created in such a way or available in such a way to discriminate against the person whose PII is being disclosed? So it went from, my health status to my health diagnosis status being much more personally identifiable. And, there's lots of studies, and when we talk about de-identification, of people who are being de-identified based on their HIV status, right? And so part of the challenge has been the FTC hasn't come up with regulations of what that is.
Because it can't.
Right, but one thing we do know from prior conversations is if we follow the rules of the road of HIPAA and the Fair Information Practices Act, the Fair
And
Credit
Section
Reporting.
222.
Well, but Section 222 is a little different than me being discriminated to get a house or to be discriminated for health insurance. So I think part of it is what is the level of personal sensitive information that is collected, because voluntarily, we give up information all the time. I give up my Safeway card. I give up my Old Navy number, my phone number for my Old Navy purchases. I don't know what is being profiled for me, but I know I'm getting a discount. So we have to kind of think through, again, consumer preferences and how they're actually identifying that.
Okay, I promise. One last question, because I don't know how this works. I'm interested in understanding how ISPs can differentiate on financial and health information without inspecting the packet. Do they have some comprehensive list of all financial institution websites, some comprehensive list of all doctor websites, and they just don't, retain that browsing information, but retain others? How do you differentiate financial and health information without actually looking at the information?
Well, I think I would say, first of all, I don't think the address of a doctor's website falls under the category of health information as the FTC treats it.
What would then? That's not content. Because all content's sensitive. You're saying health and financial information is also sensitive. So what is the health and financial information that isn't content that would fall under the FTC's sensitive category?
Well, I'm not saying I don't know if they're, overlapping circles. I don't know if, I would suspect that in most online transactions, health information is a subset of content. But there might be some that are outside, I don't know, but if it is personally identifiable health information that is not content, the FTC would still treat that as sensitive. And I don't think URLs fall in that category. At least the base URL certainly doesn't. And so, so I think calling that health or financial information just leads to the wrong conclusion about how the FTC approach works.
I do think it's worth noting that this is the protocol, the practice that broadband providers were under for years. This is the same sort of practices that the large edge providers currently operate under. And so there are definitely existing protocols for excluding that sort of information that doesn't include a sort of person sitting at a computer watching everything you're doing to make sure, whether this falls in the sensitive or non-sensitive bucket. And so I think that there are very, very well established hypotheses. We don't have the technologists to walk through exactly how that process takes place. But yeah, that is a problem that has been solved for a long time, to my understanding.
Yeah, well, encryption too. Stuff that's been advanced.
Do we have any final questions from the audience?
Quick question. Obviously, the Europeans must be wrestling with some of these same issues, and I have read in some places where there's a finding that you have an absolute right to be anonymous, a right to not be found, to be off the grid. I don't know if that was the UK or one of the Scandinavian countries. But are there any lessons to be learned from other countries in this area and what they're doing?
Well, I would just say as a high-level answer, Europe has a fundamentally different approach, although compatible through interoperability frameworks that have been put into place. They do see privacy as much more of a fundamental right, which is there's aspects of that in the U.S., but those mostly tend to be with relation to the government using information. And so we just have a different structure and a different approach. And those differences have had some effects, I think, in the vibrancy of our internet economies. And I think that might be one lesson that could be drawn from it.
In other words, we're more vibrant and they're less vibrant.
I think there is some research. I think there actually is some research to that effect.
Right.
So,
I mean, and Deborah, on the right to be forgotten, I mean, I personally like the right to be forgotten. I don't speak for MMTC on this because it gives you the right to sort of repurpose your digital dossier, right? But we can't do that here because the internet is also full of, criminal records and registries that are not forgotten in the offline space, which again makes this conversation so interesting and lucrative, right? Because we have to figure out a way to balance this online space in a way that, again, meets consumer expectations. The difference here is I think our use of the internet is just so much more robust. And it's not, again, like I said, it's not you get on the runway at exit 5 and then you get off at exit 6. You're going to be on between exit 5 and exit 6. Your commute would have incurred probably about, hits to everything on the internet and then some. And who is accountable for that? Consumers don't need to guess who has accountability for their privacy. And so I think what the FCC has done has been much more comprehensive than Europe in terms of figuring out a multi-stakeholder approach to it. And hopefully we'll continue that way.
all right, with that, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. Thank you all for coming.
I like them since I heard that.